David begins this psalm with these wonderful words. Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. And in verse 17 of that same psalm, Psalm 25, he carries on by saying, the troubles of my heart are enlarged. Bring me out of my distress. It's an interesting opening to what is the third and final part of this Psalm 25. We've looked already in previous episodes of the first 7 verses. And if you remember, in those verses, David is very direct. He's appealing to God to help him, to come to his aid, to bring deliverance. And then he takes a break out in verses 8 to 15 because he reminds himself of the God he's praying to. And there's these wonderful phrases of steadfast love and faithfulness and mercy that ooze out of those verses. And then it seems that he returns in verse 16 onwards rather, where he begins again to bring his appeal and his ache and his pain to God. And it's an interesting progression because you would almost think, well, David, you've already prayed this prayer in the first 7 verses. You've already said all that you need to say. And you've reminded yourself of the goodness and the mercy and the steadfast love of God. So surely everything's okay. But here again, he returns. Why is he returning? Is it because he lacks that sense of fervor and that sense of kind of intensity? I don't think so. The first 7 verses show us that that wasn't the case. Or it could be that he doubts God and maybe he's not feeling like he's being heard by God, or that God's not of a disposition to hear such a cry. And again, we couldn't argue that because the middle verses we looked at in the last episode tell us that David was well aware of God, of the mercy and the goodness of God. What David is experiencing is what most of us experience. And that simply is, we don't feel that sometimes the kind of full weight of what we're feeling is exercised in just one prayer. And oftentimes what intensifies that is that sense of that I'm the only one going through this. You know, when David says, turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely. The idea is we think of loneliness as being alone, and that's not the Hebrew word here. The Hebrew word is one that means only begotten, like an only son, desolate. And the kind of thinking behind the word is this. David is saying, nobody's going through this in the intensity that I am going through it. Nobody's going through this at the darkness and the weight and the burden that I'm going through this. Now, immediately, we can identify with that because how often in our lives when we pray and we turn to God, do we equally say to God, nobody else feels like this. You remember Elijah when he says, all the other prophets have gone, only I am left. And God had to remind him that several hundred hadn't bowed the knee to Baal. And we often get to a place in prayer where I think it's part of the work of the devil and part of its human nature, where we say to ourselves, you know, nobody is experiencing this like I am. Nobody's going through this darkness like I am. And it increases, it intensifies the pain, doesn't it? Because pain is an isolator. It kind of just draws us apart from everyone else. Sometimes because we can't cope with people, and other times because we feel that people can't identify with what I'm going through. This is David, caught in a place of deep pain, increased and intensified by the fact that he feels that only he is going through such difficulty. This sense of loneliness that David feels, he kind of confirms in the next verse. In verse 17, we read this, the troubles of my heart are enlarged. Bring me out of this distress. You know, when you drop back to Exodus 34 and verse 24, you read these words, for I will cast out nations before you. It's a promise God gives to Israel. And enlarge your borders. No one shall covet your land. When David talks about the troubles of his heart being enlarged, it's the same Hebrew wording as the very words God promises to Israel back in Exodus 34, when he says he will enlarge their borders. What was central to Israel was the gaining of land and the movement of a nation into some form of prosperity. And what is central to David is his heart. It's that wonderful Hebrew phrase of the core of my being. David's saying that what's in distress here, what is getting intensified, what is getting worse, what is getting more severe, is not just his headache or a difficulty or a bit of a pain in the gut, but right at the very center of his being there is distress. David's saying it's getting intensified with that sense of aloneness, with that sense of detachment, with that sense of, I am the only person going through this. And that heaviness that brings to bear. This is David in a very intense moment as we look at this particular part of the psalm. In the 18th and 19th verse, we read these words, "Consider my affliction and my trouble, and forgive all my sins. Consider how many are my foes, and with what violent hatred they hate me." We're on familiar territory with David here when we get to this connection in verse 18 between his troubles and his sin. We've already seen it in verse 7 and again in verse 11 of this very psalm. It's David's habit of knowing that wherever the difficulties are, somehow this element of David's own sense of his own guilt and his own shame is never far kind of departed from it. He makes this immediate association between tough times and disobedience. And I think for a lot of us, we can fully identify with that. We are always never far away from an intimate awareness of our own brokenness. And there are days when that hits us far more than any other day. And sadly, we often connect our tough times, our difficult moments with that sense of brokenness. It's almost like God is punishing me because I haven't behaved as I should. I didn't walk in the way I should have walked. In a sense, I've caused this. I've brought this on myself because of my sin. God has judged me, but it's been purely because of my inability to follow him and obey him. And it adds a massive weight to what is already a difficult place. When we're in a tough spot, we intensify that no end. When we add to that sense of, well, this is not only tough, but it's tough because I've not been living right. So on top of this huge weight of burden that often we carry, we now add this horrible element of guilt and shame. And that is a far heavier burden than just some tough times or financial difficulties or tough times at work. To then add that shame and that guilt as if God is doing this intentionally to get at us. Now, I don't know whether David is feeling that he's being punished here. Perhaps not. I think David just lived with awareness of his own brokenness, which spelt out for him an inability and an inadequacy to deal with the tough stuff that he had to deal with in his life. I think oftentimes he realized there was things way above him he couldn't control, and he needed God because he was, after all, someone broken and needed a bigger person, a bigger power to sort that through for him. And then when you get to verse 19, you almost capture what is, again, another layer of the weight of David. Not only is he carrying a sense of his own guilt and his own shame, not only is he feeling isolated, but he is well aware of the animosity of those around him. In fact, the word he uses is violent hatred. It's a word that means unjust and cruel. David's almost on one side saying, could it be my sin that's causing this trouble? But on the other side, he's saying the hatred is unjust. It's kind of completely exaggerated. But either way, I'm caught in this awful place of feeling this huge pressure. We get an idea when we read these words of just the intensity that David was experiencing at this moment. By the time you get to verse 20, now you get to the core of David's appeal. In this verse, David says, guard my soul and deliver me. Let me not be put to shame, for I take refuge in you. In Genesis 2:15, we read these words, God took the man and set him down in the Garden of Eden to work the ground and to keep it in order. And you get the picture of Adam going around that garden, ensuring that everything entrusted to him is kept just as it should be. Taking that time to care for and look after and tend and sort that garden. This is the word David uses when he says, guard my soul. He's asking God, in a sense, to keep it, to tend it, to look after it, to ensure nothing untoward grows out of it, to ensure that it's kept healthy and right and vibrant. He's asking for a similar care to be taken. Guard my soul, he says, and deliver me. David, no doubt, had a very complex existence. He had troubles from within his own family. He had dangers from outside. He had torments from within. He had confusions, even from providence, from the way God was dealing. Times when he couldn't understand what was happening. There was a sense of intense and foreboding about David's existence in all the troubles. And here he is, just bringing the core of his being, saying in a sense, I can't work this out, Lord, but I'm going to surrender it to you. I'm trusting that you will guard me. You will do what is right to build this heart back together again. Here's a place that when we are at our worst place, in our most lonely place, feeling totally afflicted, there's a sense in which we can trust God to guard it, to look after it, to tend it. Even at times when we feel that perhaps, will God do that? At times when we feel difficult, still we're able to bring it back. Why? Because David says, let me not be put to shame. He's not talking about being embarrassed or blushing or feeling difficult. He's talking about disappointment, collapse, and terror. Do not let this collapse, God. Don't let me implode. David is confident that all the troubles and the chaos and the torment in his life will not ultimately crush him. Why? Because God is carrying, God is guarding, tending his heart. However you feel in your life, however difficult the situations get, and sometimes they get really difficult. And adding to that, there's that horrible sense of, only I go through this, only me am I feeling this. And maybe, like David, it's because I don't live right before God. You know, all these added layers of pressure, and other people violently hate me, uncruel, unjust ways of treating me. Another layer, like an onion, we just keep putting the layers of difficulty on. The confidence David has in those moments is that God himself will be with him. He can take refuge in God. And that's the word he uses. He says, for I take refuge in you. He's abandoning all other hopes for this one last hope. Only God, he says, can sort this through. I'm fleeing from all the other anticipated places of hope because I know that ultimately only God will bring this through for me. Back in the summer of 1940, Operation Dynamo was the name given to the momentous and unprecedented evacuation of Dunkirk. It became known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. Belgian, British, and French troops were surrounded at the time by Germans' advancing troops with really no way out other than the sea. Churchill at that time announced in Parliament that the whole root and core and brain of the British Army had been stranded at Dunkirk. British, Canadian, and French battleships were able to evacuate a large amount of troops, but thousands more remained stranded, unable to escape. The British government made an unusual appeal for civilian vessels in the area to help, not convinced at all that they were going to receive an overwhelming response. However, over 800 vessels responded, causing the number of troops rescued over a 10-day period to balloon from 7,500 to over 338,000 troops. For those remaining thousands of troops stranded prior to the civilian vessels coming, their entire hope of rescue and survival lay in the hands of those civilian ships and boats. This is the picture David paints of a soul fleeing to God as the ultimate and last resource, a little bit like them troops running for these boats, knowing that they had to get on them, otherwise it would mean death or capture or worse for them. They needed that boat to be saved, and they ran with all their heart to get in them. David says, God, I turn to you. You are my refuge. You're my last hope. David's closing words in this psalm are found in the 21st and the 22nd verse. There he says this, may integrity and uprightness preserve me, for I wait for you. Redeem Israel, O God, out of all his troubles. David understood that despite God's help, despite the intervention of God, there was also a responsibility that he had. The integrity and uprightness of his life acted as a kind of protectorate. It stopped him from living with license, living with a sense of abandon, living with that sense of I can do what I want, it doesn't matter. David says, my uprightness and my integrity, they preserve me. And when we live as we ought, there's a certain element of salt that remains with us. It preserves us. It's a way of keeping our hearts focused on the things that truly matter. And this is David doing this. Forgiveness doesn't give me an excuse to live as I please. Mercy doesn't give me the permission to act in ways that are contrary to what God would want me to do. These things, forgiveness and grace and mercy and kindness from God, should stiffen my resolve to live well. They should actually act as a galvanizing influence to my commitment to live with integrity and holiness. As we wait on God, and as we pray and as we seek and as we ask God for these things, we live lives that honor those requests. We live lives that in a way reflect something of the goodness of God. And David's ultimate prayer is that as we wait on God and praise for himself, he also desires that his people, Israel, be redeemed. His people themselves be in a good place. This is David. What matters to me, he says, is my life and my people and my God. And I want these things to dovetail and flow. And in the same way, our hearts should be to keep our lives in track so that we too can be an influence and a blessing on others. Our desire is for our health, but also the health of those around us. And as you take this psalm, above all the pain and the guilt that we carry at times and the difficulties we find ourselves in, let's also remind ourselves that God is for us and he will always work to our benefit. And in doing that, there is a great responsibility that we live right and we live whole.